I'll call the meeting to order at 7 p.m. And welcome everyone. For your audience here tonight, my name is Brian Faber, and I am the chair serving as the presiding officer over the Planning Commission meeting. In consideration of others and the business conducted tonight, please silence your phones and electronic devices and refrain from speaking unless recognized. Again, this is a public meeting for the community of Glendora. We appreciate and respect your participation this evening. Presiding officer request oral roll call to be conducted.
Thank you. So at this time, I will conduct an oral roll call and request that each member respond with present when their name is called. Commissioner Davis is absent. Commissioner Koss,
Present.
Commissioner Norwood,
Present.
Vice Chair Crimmins,
Present.
Chair Faber.
Present.
Let the record show 4 members are present.
All right, at this time, we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Commissioner Norwood, I see that you enjoy this. So lead us.
All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Does anyone wish to reorder or add to the agenda? Seeing none, move on. At this time, I'm going to open the public comment period. I'm going to invite members of the public to address the legislative body. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes, speaking once on both on and off agenda items. Please fill out a speaker card and submit it to the recording admin before the close of the public comment period. Once recognized, speakers should advance to the podium, state your name and the subject matter you wish to discuss. There are public comment cards tonight, so at this time, I'm going to invite Frank Artura up to speak.
Good evening, I'm Frank Artura. Actually, the item I wanted to reference was item 4 regarding the objective design standards that we're considering for the community. And the statement I'd just like to make is, when I do things, I try to emulate greatness. Who does the most beautiful designs for their cities? And how maybe we should emulate those. So when I think of beautiful cities, I think of cities like Santa Barbara. What kind of design standards or architectural review does Santa Barbara do to make their city such a beautiful city? Do we know? Have we looked into it? Can any of you name beautiful cities? And do you know what standards that they use for architectural review and design? Do they use objective standards? Does Claremont, that's another city closer to home, what kind of design standards does that city use? So I think as a community, we should try to reflect more on, who is the best of the best? What are the most beautiful cities? And what standards do they choose to use to determine the best architectural characteristics for their community, rather than objectifying it? Architecture, not unlike art, is very subjective. And trying to objectify art is a very difficult thing to do. You can't refine art into 2 + 2 = 4. So I would ask that the community, city, and the staff look into the best ways to do this, which are the most beautiful communities, and how they try to achieve those goals. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Artura. Is there any more public comments either on Zoom or here?
Go ahead and state your name and you can fill it out after we're done.
Good evening. I'm Lisa Levy-Bush, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the Foothill Gold Line Construction Authority. I'm here if, as you go through the discussion, you have any questions about the light rail project that's underway, please let me know.
Thank you. Anybody on Zoom?
We don't
We
participate
don't
in Zoom
Zoom.
anymore.
All right, perfect. So at this time, I think we'll close the public comment period. At this time, we're gonna ask if there's any commissioner statements at this time. Seeing none, we'll move on to if there are any, a report from the Community Development Director, Jeff, and Assistant Attorney Chris.
Um, yeah.
She's on Zoom.
Oh,
Yeah, she's
Yeah,
on
it's on
Zoom.
Zoom.
I have a couple things to report, just updates on, development applications that the commission has seen, as well as new ones that have come in. So the Brandywine development, the project at 723 East Route 66 that the commission saw a couple months ago, the city council has approved that project. And so there will be a second meeting for a second reading of the ordinance that was involved for that application. But after that, we would expect the company to start working toward getting construction plans ready and submitted to the city. And usually after project's entitled, it takes, depending on how complex the project, it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months after it's entitled for us to receive construction plans. Also, we received, I want to go over a couple of applications we recently received that we'll be processing over the next months. One was at the corner of Sunflower and Gladstone. If there's a school property there, the Charter Oak Unified School District sold about 5 to 6 acres of that site to the Lewis Acquisition Corporation. And they've submitted an application for an 81-unit development on that property that we just received in the last week. Also in the last week, yeah, sorry about that. Also in the last week, we received a 46 unit application, a 46 unit condominium application for a development of housing on Arrow Highway at 631 East Arrow Highway. That's about since the Arrow Highway specific plan has been adopted, that's about the 5th development application that we've seen on that in that corridor. And also, we also are expecting an application in the next month, and we don't have one yet, for city-owned property. Thank you, Mark. At the end of San Jose near Woodland. This is a site just north of the city yard, where the city corporate yard and the Olson Company. We are expecting them to submit a 41-unit housing development application by November. Is that expectation? And just so you can, other things that you'll see starting construction soon or are in building plan check projects that have been approved at 1237 Bonnie Cove. If for those of you who remember that application at the very north end of Bonnie Cove near the 210 freeway, that's a 30-unit project. If you go by, you might see the removal of trees and other grading activity going on. They are just about ready to start construction and grading of the site. So you'll see that going on over the next months as that project gets developed. Also at Parker and Route 66, for those of you who are around, that was a few years ago. That project was entitled. It's a small development, but it was a former redevelopment agency property. I think it was an 8 or 9 unit development application with 1,000 square feet of commercial. And that project is also very near being issued building permits. And then a couple of other developments on Arrow Highway you saw in the last year, 531 East Arrow, which was a 33-unit condominium development, and 1201 East Arrow, 46-unit. Those projects are in plan check right now. So just wanted to give you a little update on some of the development activity going on in the city applications received and construction that you'll start to see over the next coming months. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Any comments from Christy?
Hi, hopefully you can see me. I don't know how the setup is there since the last time we met, we were in the library.
We can see. you.
Okay, excellent. So I'm excited to be here again. I can see the new council chambers and they look spectacular from what I'm seeing. So it's great that the commission can meet in the new chambers. I don't have anything to report as of yet. As you know, I'm still a little green, just started about a month ago as the assistant city attorney for the city, but I will be bringing you some updates as we go forward in our future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Right now, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Items on the consent calendar will be enacted by one motion without individual discussion unless a commissioner has requested it to be removed for separate discussion. Does anyone wish to poll or comment on item 2? Seeing none, I will request a motion in a second.
I will make a motion to approve.
I'll second.
So we have a motion made by Commissioner Cost, seconded by Vice Chair Crimmins. Is that correct? Okay, so we'll conduct an oral roll call. Commissioner Cost,
Yes.
Commissioner Norwood,
Yes.
Vice Chair Crimmins,
Yes.
Chair Faber,
Yes.
motion carries 4-0.
All right, we're going to move on to new business. That being in an informational study session to provide updates on the Glendora Station Area Plan Program, file number PLN 220059. Going to invite Principal Planner Hans Friedel to report, and thank you, Hans.
Well, good evening, commissioners. So we're here tonight to provide an update and receive planning commission comments in the form of an informational workshop on the Glendora Station area visioning planning work, which is being conducted under a funding agreement with LA Metro. This is to be predominantly a land use plan, focusing on how to accommodate needed housing density and transit-oriented development in the area around the Glendora Station. And I'll show you sort of the project area in a moment here. So for some background or context, the Foothill Extension Project will link 6 San Gabriel Valley communities via the Metro A line with downtown LA and the wider region. As you can see in the map, Glendora is sort of in the middle here of this map of the Foothill Extension Project, and it's slated to open in summer of 2025 or have fee-carrying service. In terms of the funding, the Glendora Station Area Plan is being funded by LA Metro's Transit-Oriented Communities Technical Assistance Program, or we may refer to as TALK-TAP. That's what that acronym is. And this funding aims to implement Metro's primary goals and incorporate Metro's transit supportive toolkit characteristics. Again, in our case, with an emphasis on housing within that half-mile area. So in terms of the study area, and the consultants are here tonight, I'll introduce them in a moment, PlaceWorks, but originally the idea was to have everything within the 1/2 mile of the Glendora Station and include that in the study area. However, after some quantitative and qualitative analysis, and again, they can go through some of the methodology in greater detail, we've refined that area, and this has been approved by Metro, to those parcels most likely to develop or redevelop within that 1/2 mile radius. So in this map here over to my right is the project boundary. And also of note, it includes 12 of our housing sites from our housing inventory from the housing element, which are those numbered sort of shaded sites. And we can come back to this stuff later during the presentation. So in terms of project schedule and some key milestones, we awarded the contract to PlaceWorks last year and currently are wrapping up sort of the existing conditions analysis phase of it. And involved now in the public engagement piece and they'll be starting some of the development scenario planning after some of the feedback we received from Planning Commission tonight. The goal is to complete the plan in summer of 2025, which aligns well with the beginning of service. So, of note, we're here in summer of 2024. Earlier today, we had an open house in the Bidwell Forum. Which we mailed notices to everybody in that 1/2 mile area. We emailed some of the development community, architects, and put it on social media. We had a pretty good turnout. We had over 30 members of the public come today, so that was nice for us. And I think PlaceWorks again can talk a little bit about some of the information they received, some of the conversations. But it was a nice event, and we had some of the materials are actually behind you here, which they'll talk about. That were on display there. With that, I think this is a good point. I'll introduce Alan Loomis with PlaceWorks to continue the presentation, and he's the principal on their side that's managing the project for them.
Thank you, Hans and commissioners. Nice to see you again this evening. You'll recall
some time ago, we were in front of you talking about objective design standards, which we'll give you an update later. Next item on that project. The two projects are somewhat interrelated. We can talk about how that is during the Q&A, I suppose. But just to lead you through the analysis that we've done so far and kind of some of the early conclusions we've drawn, I'm going to give on these slides a little bit of like the highlights of a kind of larger existing conditions document that's part of your packet. So in the packet, there's not only the slideshow, but there's this existing conditions document, and then there are the posters that we shared in the public forum this afternoon. So you're getting a lot of information. The report itself, and Ed, can you hand me it? It starts with this cover. So we can print it 8.5 by 11 color double-sided. It'll turn out just nice. That's the existing conditions report. The posters that we shared this afternoon are a bit of a summary of that. Slideshow is going to be a very high-level summary. So we did a couple of things where we looked at the existing conditions of the area around this, around the station within that half-mile radius, and more specifically, the sort of focus area defined by that heavy black line on the graph. So one of the things we did is we mapped things that, like we call them community assets. So this is public facilities, community serving retail, parks, et cetera. So every one of those icons represents a different kind of feature or asset. And as you probably will know, this area is very well endowed with a great number of, things that the community could avail themselves of, or they might need in the course of, kind of an everyday life, a couple of months or so, or daily life. So lots of great assets already here. Another component of what we did when we looked at this is we also looked at some of the development that's already going on along the Gold Line or the A line, looking at some of the neighboring communities. So we did a little bit of an inventory of some of the more recent developments you are seeing in Monrovia or Duarte or Azusa. And so there's a component of the existing conditions report that then identifies usually about 3 new developments in each one of those cities, which we characterized in a kind of similar methodology in terms of their density, the number of units they're providing, their height, the rental condo, got a number of metrics that we sort of identified when we looked at those. This is really intended to be not necessarily a roadmap of what you should do here in Glendora, but an indication of what the market in the San Gabriel Valley is producing when you've got development up against the trains. And in some cases in those cities, that's the result of deliberate city planning that they want that kind of development there. In other cases, that's maybe more market forces. There's different, number of different kind of reasons why they're seeing that development. But there is a kind of consistency that we could say in the San Gabriel Valley, this kind of intensity of development is being supported by the market because it's happening in all the neighboring cities up and down the train line. So kind of zooming into our site and Glendora again, more specifically in some of the quantitative analysis that we did. One of the things we looked at was we rated all the properties in the area by a scoring system. The maximum score you could get in the system is 10 points. And we assigned, start with 0, and then we started assigning points to each individual property if they hit off certain kinds of characteristics. And what we're looking at is the characteristics are the things that would indicate that the site might be primed for some new investment or new development. So if it's a vacant lot, for example, that gets a number of points. Vacant lots, presumably something will happen with it in the future. Lots over that are fairly large are very appealing to the sort of large scale developers because you get a big piece of land. If 2 lots, separate lots, but owned by the same person or the same entity, they get extra points because now you can, again, consolidate properties. So there's a methodology we used to score all these properties, on this ranking from 1 to 10. Side note, if it was a designated historic property, that kind of automatically went to 0. So like that's probably not a very likely redevelopment site. And so this is the map we came up with. The dark blue colors indicate the properties that scored very high in this methodology. And then the light yellow, the more yellowish colors are the ones that scored on the lower side, and then the kind of medium blue are right down the middle. So you can kind of see just off the bat some of the sites that sort of like jump the distribution of these kinds of sites. The ones to kind of point out that are sort of immediately obvious are the 2 big parcels directly south of the train platforms, which is where Metro currently owns. And then one of those sites is actually under development, was up for sale when we're doing this methodology, this analysis. So like those are sites that immediately score really high as we kind of work our way through this scoring system. There are, however, some anomalies when we apply this kind of methodology. So if you can read the directions, the City Hall Civic Center complex we're sitting in scored really high as a potential redevelopment site. Well, we said that's probably not very likely. So we did some quantitative kind of adjustment or qualitative adjustment to this map where we kind of thought about it a little bit more carefully. So we said the Civic Center complex block, that's going to be a low redevelopment site. Same with the hospital on Route 66, that scored lower. So we kind of adjusted the map based on some information, kind of qualitative information that we sort of thought was good common sense. Couple of takeaways from this now, this kind of refined map. Just because a site was colored blue or scored 10 doesn't necessarily mean it should be redeveloped. It should be reinvested. It doesn't mean that it has to. What this is really just an indication of where is the clustering of sites that we would have the greatest likelihood to be reinvested. A site that scored like 1 doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay the same forever. Somebody might still come forward and do something on that property. So this is not necessarily a map of what should happen. It's a map of what we think has some degree of likelihood. That helps focus our attention because there are hundreds of parcels in here. And so we really wanted to think carefully about which parcels really had kind of the greatest propensity or possibilities for change. The other thing this map did is it, in most cases, kind of confirmed the assumptions that the housing element made about particular sites. So in this map, the sites that are hatched with the kind of like purple hatching, those are the sites that were identified in the housing element. And so most of those sites end up scoring in the blue territory. There's some that have green, the more yellow color coding, but generally this methodology said the sites that were identified in the housing element are probably good possibilities for reinvestment or new investment. So we overlaid these two things after we did this analysis. And like I said, this is kind of where we came up with. What we did, however, this map here is just a little too granular to really think about clearly. We ended up sort of saying, well, the sites that are colored blue tend to cluster generally into some focus areas. And so we identified about 8 different focus areas that are based on sort of common characteristics. So you can see number 1 is the Vaughn's Shopping Center. So that whole property, or it's actually a cluster of properties, but all of that gathered together is like one big site, we think. The sites along Foothill between the Vaughns coming to the village, that's another kind of cluster of properties, particularly the ones on the north side. They're pretty deep and they back up against the wash. So they're like larger than other sites in the kind of area. So that's why they kind of stand out as having like some redevelopment potential. Those clusters, so you get this kind of cluster of Foothill. And we'll go through these real quick, but that's generally, this was a way we began to say, like, there are different ways we could think about this area based on these clusterings. And so we thought, you know, we could potentially, as we move forward, we could say, well, we're going to come up with a kind of like, maybe there's a scenario that makes sense for Vermont Avenue, which is number 6 on the map, and maybe a slightly different scenario for the adjacent number 7, which is where Albertsons is located. But maybe at the end of the day, we say, like, we really shouldn't be thinking about number 8 at all. Like that cluster, just, you know, there's not a lot of interest in doing anything there. Maybe it's tied up with like long-term leases or something, like, so we just drop that. So you could kind of view this as a kind of puzzle pieces of different options could kind of come together to help sort of shape the overall vision for the development. So I'll run through these with the visuals so you can see what they look like, because the map is a little abstract. So number 1 was, and they're not necessarily in any particular order, but the Vaughan Shopping Center. So this stands out for being a kind of interesting possibility in large measure because most of the land is occupied with surface parking lot. It does have some constraints because there's actually a flood control channel that runs underneath that parking lot and a kind of like, it's like a spaghetti shape. So anybody wanted to do anything there would have to deal with this kind of flood control channel that runs through the middle of the site. You don't see it today because it's a parking lot. So it's got some constraints. As I mentioned, then the next one is Foothill Boulevard from the Vaughan Center going to the village. So if you look at that, like I said, on the north side of the street, there's a lot of fairly deep lots that back up against the wash. They're the flood control channel. A lot of 1-story kind of older commercial buildings. And then there's a fairly decent collection of properties that sort of back up against the railroad tracks, that kind of weird triangle shape. That's potentially has a lot of interest. It's a fairly large piece of land that's kind of hidden away. So seems like kind of an interesting possibility. This site, which is directly across from City Hall, the Village Gateway Center where the 99-cent store is, the entire site, the entire block was identified in the housing element as a possible site. Has an enormous amount of interest from our team. Again, half of the block is occupied by surface parking, so it's generally underutilized in terms of development to land ratio. And it has the advantage of being like right at the south foot of the village. You know, it could be a really interesting south anchor to the village or west anchor to this Foothill Boulevard corridor that we just described earlier. There's a collection, 2 different sites that are the city-owned parking lots that become really interesting too. They score pretty high on our matrix, mostly because they're parking lots. But there's the one directly across from right over there, and then the sets of parking lots on the east side of the village that are city-owned. And those become really interesting in part because the city controls the land. So if the city did want to see some kind of new activity around the village, the city would actually be able to be in the driver's seat. They could say, we want to keep it as parking, or we want to do something there that integrates parking or doesn't integrate parking. But the city has the kind of is in the driver's seat literally on these 2 sites in terms of how they might evolve in the future. The next one we highlight, although it seems unlikely that anything would happen here, is the post office. It's again a big site, a lot of surface parking. This one stands out because as you exit the future Gold Line station, the first thing you're going to see is the backside of the post office and the razor wire. It's not exactly the most attractive, welcoming to Glendora image you can imagine. Unfortunately, the post office outright owns the land, and if you kind of know your local history, you know that the post office recently tried to close the post office in Azusa and consolidate here, but Azusans got upset, so they're keeping the post office in Azusa. But it tells you that the post office has a commitment to this property in the long term. You know, but that being said, you know, what can we do to improve the post office? And if the city had a lot of surplus land, I suppose they could enter into some sort of negotiation with the federal government, move the post office to that other piece of land, and we could do something more attractive here. Unfortunately, the city doesn't have a chunk of land this big to trade with the post office, but nonetheless, the post office is a really interesting site to think about in the context of the train. Going south from the train station or the train platforms is Vermont Avenue, which has a mix of, it's a variety of different properties. It's not all one single property. That is a mix of kind of older industrial buildings from the 50s and 60s. There's some industrial activities that are still happening there. Some are occupied by kind of more like back office, contractors' offices, things of that nature. You know, and some of the buildings are vacant, mostly, and I'm talking mostly on the west side of the street here. On the east side of the street, however, is where the Metro lot is, and there's the big parcel that just recently went up for sale. So we know that on the east side of the street, there's a lot of interest from housing developers to do fairly relatively dense housing on those 2 sites next to the train. So the conversation about what Vermont should look like is starting to, you know, really needs to be accelerated. I will say that at the workshop that we had this afternoon, at least 3 property owners or representatives of property owners on Vermont Avenue came forward and talked to us. So that was a really interesting conversation to get a sense of what's happening in those buildings and how they're being used and the property owners' interests in kind of staying there. But this is an area that I think we have to come up with a plan for what Vermont should be one way or another, because the train and some other things are going to kind of force the city's hand if we don't have an attitude towards this street. Adjacent to that is the Albertson Shopping Center. Again, a site that is fairly large parcel, lots of big surface parking lots, so it stands out in our kind of quantitative analysis. It's actually a couple different parcels, so it's not just one. So it's conceivable to think that this is either done as maybe reimagined as one giant development or a kind of a couple pieces of developments. So far, there doesn't seem to be any indication that Albertson's plans to leave, so there may be a long-term, you know, business that stays in the equation with other things happening around it. But it's a pretty big site right next to the train, so it's going to be attractive to developers, I think. And then the last one is this kind of tale of kitty corner off Route 66 from the Albertson site south, very tail end of, like south end of, south, the block of Glendora Avenue, south of Route 66, and then Route 66 going to the west. And again, this is similar to Foothill Boulevard, and it's a mix of kind of smaller sites with a kind of a number of older structures on them that, you know, in the scheme of like housing around transit, these are probably not the highest and best use for these sites. So, and these sites were also identified in the housing element as potential housing sites. So run through all of that, basically as a primer to what we asked the public today and what would be welcome for you to kind of opine on as part of our process. The posters behind you are the posters that we shared with the public and the various dots and kind of notes that people shared with it and some of the feedback we were, that people shared with us about these areas. The question we were really asking and that we would ask you is, as we think about these different focus areas, the question is, if there is going to be some sort of development around there, what kind of development should we be encouraging in these different focus areas? If there should be any development being encouraged or different kinds of transformation for these different districts is sort of the question. One of the things we got into this afternoon or also was like, there may be a bit of a phasing strategy in the sense that there are certain things the city might want, certain areas the city might want to focus in on first, and other areas that might end up being more like a, not in the next 10-year plan, but like, you know, think about that happening in 20 years. And so that was a really interesting conversation we engaged in this afternoon, is thinking of these as kind of being prioritized and not everything happening all at once. So I think the question, you know, we really would welcome your thoughts about these focus areas, maybe other sites that we missed that you think are of kind of interest. You know, or do we have these right? You know, if you were to think about development in these areas, how would you think of it? You know, what would you think be the most kind of appropriate kind of development characteristics to occur in these areas? So we'd use these kind of visual prompts of the different sizes of residential development or mixed-use development as kind of visual prompts to sort of suggest what might happen. Most of those images are drawn from neighboring communities or Glendora itself. And so that's where we're at, is thinking about these sites, taking public input on this whole question. And as we filter through all that input, we'll begin to refine development scenarios and ultimately an overall plan that, as Hans indicated in the timeline, would come back for further public discussion in the early side of next year, and then hopefully in front of City Council for adoption by summer of next year. The other thing I'll note is that all of this information is now available on a website, which is GlendoraStationPlan.com. Went back and forth on the name. So GlendoraStation.com. Yeah. Get my right one in here. GlendoraStationPlan.com. That's the right website. So you can see all this information and report on that website. And the content that we shared tonight and we shared in the afternoon in terms of like the questions in these boards is also mirrored in an online survey that will be open through December 1, which is basically the end of Thanksgiving weekend. So for the next 2 months, there's an opportunity for the public to kind of, you know, provide their feedback through a website. So we're very much in the stage of like, this is where we're at. We've looked at the city and this, come up with some ideas about what kind of sites we think are out there. And we're looking for feedback and people's opinions about what should happen around the station. So with that, happy to come back and answer any questions, and Hans will jump up if specific questions about anything I can't answer.
Thank you very much, Al. I think at this time, we're just discussions, right? So open to question to Commissioner Cox.
I don't know necessarily questions at this point, just kind of thoughts that I have. In terms of, you know, I always personally favor mixed use development. I think residential is important, but I also think, you know, when I hear people in Glendora talking, they want, obviously we want residential, but we also want businesses. We also want restaurants. We also want, you know, we want grocery stores. We want all those, you know, other things. So I think the residential is important, but I think we should also, you know, try to encourage mixed use facilities and development, I think is really, really important. And I'm not sure, I think that that's what Azusa is doing next, and with some of their facilities that they've built around stations, just the ones that I've seen appear to be mixed use. And I think that that's, to me, seems very efficient. I hope the city doesn't decide to do away with parking because we already have a parking issue. And so I don't think doing away with parking would be good. But I'm excited about looking at these areas because I think there's a lot of possibilities. And I'm really looking forward to, kind of spending some time kind of mulling this over and thinking about the possibilities of what we want this to look like.
Commissioner Norwood?
So of these properties, I mean, I look at them all and I could see the potential for all the development. I've been here long enough to know that like, and I'm gonna ask staff to help chime in on this a little bit, like some of them on Vermont are considered like non-conforming, that they could do a certain amount of upgrades and work on them, but if they got too much redevelopment or remodel that they were rezoned, so I'm looking for a little direction on that.
The uses that on Vermont are both allowed, commercial and it's a mixed use zoning.
Okay, but there was a time where they talked about the non-conforming lots, couldn't do any work or upgrades on them, then they would have to go fall into a particular zone that what it was zoned at now.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about when we last updated the Route 66 specific plan there, but those uses are, it's a little bit of a difficult situation because on one hand, those uses are permitted, the manufacturing, commercial uses are permitted, and it was the manufacturing uses that were the issue. But at the same time, the city has also designated those properties as housing sites in the city's housing element in order to achieve our RENA numbers. So while those uses are definitely allowed and they can, expand and remodel and do those types of things, I think it seems like the city's policy now at this point is for housing development along that corridor.
Okay, thank you. And as far as or the metro comes in, or if the city would eminent domain ever be in the equation, or I know that's not something that I was involved in Arcadia when Gold Line came through there, and there was discussion on it. I don't think it ever happened, but is that something that could be on the table?
For this, are you saying for the city to use its power of eminent domain to buy or assemble property for
It was in the
development?
yeah, so it was in the Gold Line corridor.
Well, I think it's one thing to do right-of-way acquisition, and having to use eminent domain if it's a tool that, public agencies can do to acquire right-of-way. And by right-of-way, what I mean is a street, or in the Gold Line's case, right-of-way for a railroad. That's a public use. But eminent domain cannot be used to acquire private property for private development. There's a different, we can't, let's say the city, we want our new restaurant. So we're going to buy out 3 properties on Vermont and we're going to clear it and sell it to the restaurant that we love. The city cannot do something like that. It's eminent domain's only supposed to be used under the law for something that is a public purpose, like a public street, a public railroad, or a public park, not for private development.
Okay.
You may be recalling in years past when RDA was alive and things, that was done in those days, but not currently. There's allowed.
Okay. And the last question I have, and it doesn't, and maybe it's outside of the half-mile radius, but that property that sits not too far out of the half-mile radius, that where the old Tuesday Morning is, there's a handful of properties there, businesses on there's a gas station on the corner. It's across from 31
A
Flavors.
little east on Route 66.
Yeah, and there's an old tennis court back there, and it's on a large parking area with a large, I would say dilapidated, older businesses, some doing well, but it just doesn't, it's not very sightly.
Yeah,
Uh,
that site is definitely outside the
The half
city area,
mile.
the
Okay.
metro station
Okay.
area plan.
And did the business, is there tax breaks? Is there financial incentives for the business owners within that half mile to engage with the developers? To, maybe from the metro, the federal government, state of California?
As far as I understand, at the moment, the city does not have any kind of explicit policies to do that. That may possibly be a recommendation that comes out of a report, that there should be some sort of program that the city might start to encourage desired development in this area. But as of today, that's not the case. You know, the state continually passes new laws that generally preempt local land use authority that is intended to encourage generally housing development around transit. You know, so there's those kinds of incentives. And then there's, you know, any developer that wants to take advantage of affordable housing density bonus, which applies everywhere in the city, like that could be applied here too. So those are the kind of incentives that come to mind at the moment. That developers might be able to take advantage of, but at the moment, there's no fiscal advantages that I can think of. The one I would say that, however, I would asterisk that and say, in the kind of complicated matrix by which affordable housing developers seek tax credit funds from the state, proximity to transit gives you extra points. So a affordable housing developer might be interested in this area because of the proximity to transit, and it gets them a couple extra points. And as I understand it, it's very hard for developers to get the points to be competitive on the point scheme if they're not near transit. So again, the state's kind of built a system that encourages development toward near transit.
One of the things that's kind of related to that, but also what Cost had mentioned, is that you had added a question about parking, and that's another one that is an incentive for developers is, while we're not changing our parking standards, the state has already imposed it for us, and there's state law that there's no parking requirements within a half mile of a station, unless it's for certain things, but in most cases that were to apply here would be not.
I would say we had some pretty robust discussions about that this afternoon, because developers theoretically could build a 300-unit project, and if they said we don't want to provide parking, the city would not be in a position to say you must provide parking. What we know, however, is that banks won't finance that kind of project, and you just have to look anywhere in the San Gabriel Valley. You're not going to see a residential project of any scale that is not parked in some fashion. You know, so it's a somewhat of a red herring, I think, to say that's a possibility, because I think the market reality is even if somebody's building right next to the train station, they will be providing parking. And I would guess that they will probably provide, you know, somewhere like at least one parking space per unit or one parking space per bedroom, depending on the scale of the project. But, you know, we'll see what people start proposing.
So that's an interesting concept. I haven't really, so lenders do have so they have to submit plans on their project of what they're in 300 units and there's no parking, and the lender could say, we're not interested?
Yeah, the banks that finance these kinds of projects are going to be looking for parking, notwithstanding what the state law said. So the example I gave, and I've given to staff and some others, is once upon a time I worked for the city of Santa Monica, and there was a site in downtown Santa Monica that was 1 block from the ocean, 1 block from the train station, the end of the expo line. It was entitled for like a 4 or 5 story residential development with 0 parking. They could not get financing to build that. So they backed off, and they came back with they just renovated the existing 1-story building that was there for a bank and a coffee shop.
Interesting.
And I think, you know, if downtown Santa Monica can't get a project like that financed, I don't think it could be financed here in Glendora. You know, downtown LA, downtown San Francisco is a different story, but
Because nobody would buy it with no
Yeah.
parking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is the banks are trying to make sure they can make.
Oh,
their money.
I get it. It's
Nobody's
the
gonna
first time
buy
I've
it.
heard that concept, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Nobody's going to buy a place like that if they can't park. Yeah.
or rent, you know, I mean.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Vice Chair Crimmins?
Thank you for the information. It's interesting. Obviously, a lot of work went into it, so appreciate it. let's see, I was curious about the post office, how likely that was. You answered that. Parking lots, you said sparked a lot of interest with theirs, and I'm assuming that's just because you could plop a structure there for the same amount of parking and develop the rest of it into housing mixed use, right? Is that why those parking lots are so appealing?
I think the parking lots become appealing just because the ratio of development on the land to like the lot coverage is so low and you've got a grocery store with a bunch of parking lots. And we know from looking at other communities that those are often the first sites that a big institutional developer is gonna grab. The amount of tenants and the things they have to demolish in order to clear the site is much lower than assembling a site with, 4 single-family homes all down in a row, right? Less complicated to do that, take
Gotcha,
that
okay.
kind of property and redevelop it.
Thank you. I think that was pretty much it. I jumped on the website real quick. It looks nice. Definitely encourage people to go take a look at that and take the survey as well. And that's pretty much it for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like a lot of work went into it too, so appreciate everything. I kind of just, I guess you're just kind of looking for comments and thoughts from us too, right? So, right.
Absolutely. And I think given that we got the survey open through December 1, I think we'd invite the commission if further thoughts are prompted in
Sure.
the next coming days, or as you drive around the area,
Right.
feel free to email staff or us and
I'll
log
definitely
in
give
the
you,
website. And we'll take their input in that way too.
can give you some, my high level thoughts, at least right now, seeing it for this time and looking at it for a few days, but the city-owned parking lots downtown, I mean, I think that is what makes downtown Glendora nice. All the events that go on down there, the ability to go down there and park and get in and out. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's the Christmas stroll is still impossible to park, but it could be even worse if you take away all those spots. So personally not a fan of losing the parking lots. Is there a parking lot as part of the transit station? Or do you know? or-
Yes, the parcel directly south of the station, which they've been using as kind of a staging yard for the construction. As the train comes online, that will be redeveloped as a parking lot.
Gotcha.
That being said, Metro, as a regional agency, has a lot of lots like that on their future transit lines. And they put about 20 of those sites, including Glendora, out to a massive RFQ, or request for qualifications, to the development community, with an interest in saying, we want to get a short list of qualified developers, and then we will put out one by one, these are in clusters, these 20 odd sites out into the development world to see what sort of development interest there will be. So in the immediate future, I think you'll see a parking lot there for park and ride purposes, but I would say in the long term, Metro's policy is going to be to develop those sites with housing. And
Yeah, I think the Azusa Gold Line, right, it had a parking lot at first and it was open and then they started charging and I think they're charging it now at that. Gold
Yeah,
Line,
I can't-
right? So.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly the details of it, but that's Metro's long-term policy
Sure.
is to, and they've actually said very explicitly at the Metro board level, they want to support affordable housing.
Which makes sense. So, but you would, if you lost the parking spots that we have downtown right now, you wouldn't be backfilling it by any parking spots there that could be available.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, Metro, I suppose, could impose a condition of a deal point with a developer to say, we want you to replace this commuter parking as part of a new development, whether it's in a structure or underground or something. That's something they could do. I don't know what their policy is on that explicitly, but.
And then I know we've talked about in the past a little bit about the number of grocery stores. I forget why we were talking about it, but the number of grocery stores in Glendora, and
Mhm.
it seems like they're
They're on.
all profitable and staying in business. So it seems like it's something the city likes at least, and uses and likes those parking lots. So I'm going from my not liking so much to the ones I like more. The rest of them, the 2, 3, 6, and 8, those are all spaces that definitely seems like they could use some revitalization one way or the other. So those ones seem really good. I mean, the post office would seem great. It's really close to it, but I get the uphill battle you may have, but I don't know, maybe there's some trade and can reposition the post office, but yeah, that's kind of my.
I had a couple more comments. Regarding the city's parking lots, one other comment I want to make is we want Glendora to grow, but we want Glendora to remain Glendora. And one of the things about Glendora is our free parking downtown. That's one of the things that is unique to Glendora that a lot of other cities don't have. So I think that's kind of, there'd probably be a mutiny if we took that away. The other thing regarding the post office, I know you said, obviously that's not, Glendora doesn't own that, obviously the federal government does, but you talked about possibly working with them to kind of fix that up a little bit. Is that something that we are able to do? Kind of like work with them to like make it a little less,
Like there's,
Icky?
yeah, I know there's been conversations at the staff level with trying to get the post office to say, could you put a mural on there? I know that at one point there was this part of some of the early studies for Ada and how that would link to the train platforms. There was like renderings of like a mural on the side of the building.
Well,
And so
even-
it's a conversation that keeps coming up, and I think
Yeah.
as our work, we should, if we can't move the post office, then we should definitely be like resurrecting those ideas and saying, they're good ideas, let's keep pushing for them.
well, even something as simple as plants. I mean, I noticed last time I went to the post office, they have this big plant bed, and I don't know what you call it, like a plant bed in front of it. And there's a bush and then half of it is completely empty. And it looks absolutely terrible. And I just think they can't afford to buy a bush to put in here. I mean, just something as simple as, a bush to make it look a little nicer, I don't know what kind of, relationship we have with the federal government in terms of, beautifying that up a little bit. But obviously, I don't think we're gonna be able to move it, but maybe kind of working with them to make it look a little nicer, might be easier. But other than that, I think it's great. And the Azusa station, by the way, does have parking. They built that parking deck, but it's a very small parking deck. It's never been enough for their needs. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's great. And one more question. What was the website? Is it www.glendorastation.com? Is that correct?
Station plan.
Glendora Station Plan.
Glendora Station
Glendora
Plan.
Station plan.com.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it for me.
I would just say it would be a great idea to help with the post office, but having been in that situation personally with a bag of money to hand to them, it's almost impossible to get them to change anything.
Buy a bush and
Yeah.
plant it for them.
Yeah, I agree. Any other comments from the commission? No? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'll be back up here momentarily.
We need a motion to receive and file the report.
Okay, so at this time, I'm going to ask for a motion to receive and file the report.
I'll make a motion to receive and file the report.
I'll second.
So we have a motion made by Commissioner Cross, seconded by Vice Chair Crimmins. Commissioner Cost,
Yes.
Commissioner Norwood,
Yes.
Vice Chair Crimmins,
Yes.
Chair Faber,
Yes.
motion carries 4-0.
Right. Moving on to item number 4, an informational study session to provide updates on progress made creating objective design standards for the community, file number PLN 22-0042. I'm going to invite Hans back up to report on this one.
Okay, well, good evening again, commissioners. And similarly to when I was up here last, we're going to provide an update and receive your feedback in the form of an informational workshop on the work and progress being made on developing objective design standards for Glendora. We have so just for some background here, California state law, particularly related to trying to get housing and the housing crisis in the state, SB 35 and SB 330, or some in particular, of California's Affordable Housing Act, require that projects that qualify for streamlined approval process, usually affordable housing or housing type projects, must meet objective zoning, general plan subdivision, and design standards. Glendora currently has a mixture of objective and subjective design guidelines and standards sort of throughout its zoning code and specific plans. Just for some, high level perspective, objective design standards are written as requirements rather than guidelines. They are not something that has discretion, but are non-discretionary. I think an easy way we always think about it is shall instead of should, but there's more to it than just that, of course. So, Furthermore, for some background, our housing element program 16 action item 24 of our adopted and certified housing element talks about revising or calls for the city to revise our design guidelines to be objective and remove language requiring interpretation of design quality. Eliminating subjective evaluation regarding architectural quality of a development or site standards or site elements, could lead to more consistency in building design. It creates a more predictable environment for the development community. Say, hey, this is what we would like to see in Glendora, and sort of remove some of that human judgment piece there. Creating objective design standards was also a city commitment under its SB2 grant, Task 2. So something we've been working on for a while. As in the previous presentation, there's a little bit of update on the schedule. So, in summer of last year, we sort of really kicked this process off and awarded Placeworks the contract to manage this or to do this work for us with us managing. We had a kickoff meeting from August of last year with Planning Commission. So we kind of presented some of these things to you then. Over the spring and summer of this year, we worked on online surveys. And I'll let Placeworks sort of talk about our online survey, but we've had a survey that went out on social media and got a fair amount of responses, which they can give us an update on tonight. And earlier today, as I mentioned, we had an open house where one half of the room was objective design standards and the other half was the Metro Talk Tap Glendora Station plan. So we were getting feedback and kept the survey open for another day. And again, some of that feedback that we received in the open house today will be gathered up by Placeworks and be included in the plans and reports that will come. Objective design standard stuff is going to come back before you. This is an update. Eventually this is going to lead to a pretty big rewrite of our zoning code. Again, as I mentioned, we have guidelines and standards throughout different sections of it. So it's going to be a large ordinance. And it will come back eventually, probably more updates. And then eventually it'll be in the form of, public hearing for a zoning code update and to our specific plans to basically, enact and replace the subjective stuff with objective stuff. And so that will be coming again. Target date will be next summer to kind of get this work done. So I think we'll be looking at more engagement and hearings and stuff in the spring leading into summer, hopefully getting it before City Council. So with that, I'll invite Alan back up with Placeworks to give us an update on some of the objective design standards work, and then we look forward to hearing your feedback.
All right, thank you again, Hans and commissioners. We do a lot of objective design standards work across the state of California. It's been a kind of like a huge industry, in a sense, kind of cottage industry since the state enacted all these laws. Every city up and down the state is kind of scrambling to figure out like, what are they going to do to meet these kind of requirements by the state. I would say that a number of us, including our staff, was at the state planning conference in Riverside earlier over the past 3 days. And some of the most popular panels of presentations were related to objective design standards. You had consultants and city planners and rooms that were overflowing into the hallway trying to figure out how to respond to this and trying to learn from each other. So it's a very hot, very new issue up and down the state. We're all trying to learn from each other the best practices. We have worked now, I forget the number. I know I've got 5 active cities that I'm including Glendora, in which I'm writing objective design standards. The advantage of that is that I often hear from a developer or a city planner over in city X. They catch something that we're working on and we're sort of writing something similar in city Y. And we're like, well, that was a really good catch. Let's come back and fix it on this draft over here. So we're kind of getting a bit of a benefit of groupthink in our office and across the state on this particular topic that's very new. So I think what's useful to kind of think about is, what does this actually cover? One of the things that objective design standards are not intended to do is to cover the sort of things in your zoning code or your municipal code that govern basic density. So that's the issues of like your density is measured by units per acre, height, overall setbacks from property lines to the street. Like objective design standards will not override those those criteria that are already in place. It's really intended to begin to shape what happens. If you imagine your basic zoning code creates a box, and the objective design standards are intended to sculpt that box a little bit more effectively. But the basic box is going to stay the same. So it's important to say that outright. We generally are kind of varying in our kind of draft. We're covering these issues, any kind of lots of issues related to site planning, kind of site layout, mass and scale, or the kind of the way a building steps back or is twisted as it gets taller. The sort of degree, how much a building can go long before it has to go in and out. Those are kind of the topics that we're sort of looking at, beginning to address. We've got a big discussion in our kind of working draft about open space and amenities. So generally speaking, you don't have any real standards for what kind of amenities you expect out of multifamily projects. You just say X amount of square feet of open space, but what happens there is traditionally, in as many design issues has been kind of negotiated in a public hearing. As developers propose somebody, and so they said, well, I don't think you should do a swimming pool. Maybe you could make it a little smaller and put a tot lot over there. That's the kind of subjective design criteria that the state is really asking cities to stop doing. So open space and amenities is a big discussion for us. And then we do, in some cases, start talking about materiality and architectural finishes. And we are now cracking open the notion of, based on the survey, on architectural style. So I'll get into that. The design standards that we're writing for Glendora will cover single family accessory units all the way through commercial and industrial, multifamily, and mixed use. We're really only obligated by the state to deal with multifamily development, but to staff's credit and their vision is that we're going to develop a similar criteria for evaluating all projects in the city, so that there's not like two different pathways and kind of like you over here get a special treatment, you get a different kind of treatment. The idea to make the playing field very even and equitable, which I think is admirable, although adds a lot of kind of complexity to our work. So as Hans mentioned, we launched a community survey last year on Earth Day. Initially, on Earth Day was as a handout at the event, a kind of 2-page survey. But we've had an online survey that's been open since then, and as of the start of this meeting, we had 547 responses to the online survey. Which, if you were to think about it in terms of like a ratio of like to the city population, doesn't sound very good. But in similar communities where we've done these kinds of online surveys, if we crack 200, we're like throwing up the confetti and saying we got huge turnout. So your public information office has done a great job of getting the word out that the surveys here in the community has responded very admirably and kind of providing us feedback. So we're pretty excited about that response. So some of the key takeaways, one of the questions that we asked, we asked 2 questions related to architectural style. So we had this page on the physical survey and then mirrored in the online survey, and we're asking community members, of these architectural styles, which do you prefer for residential development and which do you prefer for commercial development? And on the multifamily style housing development, residential development, nobody was surprised that the community prefers craftsman architecture. I think we all predicted that coming forward, but the survey data agrees with us, pretty overwhelming. The next 2 most popular architectural styles for residential development is Spanish Revival and what we call the farmhouse style. Farmhouse, you do have an example of this in the southern part of the city, right next to the Glendora market or the public market, sort of food hall. There's a development there that I would categorize as kind of a farmhouse style. So that's pretty popular. We see that, in fact, across a lot of the work we're doing throughout San Gabriel Valley and Inland Empire. It seems to be a very popular style with buyers and renters. Slightly different mix when we asked what about commercial development or kind of non-residential development. In this case, the overwhelming community preference was for a Main Street architectural aesthetic. Main Street architecture aesthetic, I would say, characterized by like your historic buildings in the village. It's the brick structures, like the cornice and et cetera. So it's very familiar kind of aesthetic in the community, followed by Craftsman and Spanish Revival. You can see you can sort of see it at the bottom. There was a Route 66 or kind of Googie style imagery that we threw in there, because if you actually read through the current Route 66 specific plan, it sort of encourages that kind of aesthetic. So we felt like we should ask it, but it's not popping up very high on the preference list. So what this leads us to think as we write these new objective design standards is that we're trying to think now, should we have some requirement for projects of a certain scale to sort of adhere to one of these architectural styles that the community has a strong preference for? And then the more complicated question is like, how do we go about doing that? How do we write this in a way that's like objective and kind of leads people to kind of desirable outcomes and on? So that's something we're working through, and we have many ideas. We've done this in other communities, so we've got some thoughts about how we can approach that. Another question we asked on the survey was related to kind of the open space amenities for multifamily development, and so this is a kind of example of the page on the physical handout. And you can see the desire for open space and kind of park space kind of tops the list of kind of desirable characteristics on the online survey. And then trails and kind of children's play areas comes in the next two. Interestingly, we asked a similar question this afternoon related to the Glendora station area. And the winner of all a similar list and the one that got the most dots, meaning most people were voting it for it, was also trails and walking paths. So you're a very active community that eats a lot, apparently, the grocery stores. So this is indicative or helpful to sort of think about what are the specific kinds of open amenities that we should be writing into the objective design standards, so we're not overlooking things that are desired by the community. As part of our work doing the design standards, we're also preparing this user's guide, and that early draft of that is included in your packet. One of the reasons we're doing this user's guide, which is illustrated, is that ultimately, as Hans mentioned, the objective design standards is going to live in the zoning code. So it's going to be an ordinance it will have illustrations and diagrams, but it's going to read like a zoning code and will be, for the average person, I think, a little bit kind of opaque and kind of hard to read through. You know what zoning codes look like. I'm sure you're aware that the average person opens up your zoning code and doesn't know what to do with it. So we're preparing this user's guide, which is intended to help customers, homeowners, builders, applicants, architects, planning commissioners, public, city staff, be able to navigate the kind of complexities of this ordinance that we're going to end up preparing. And so what we've done with it is it runs through a series of very typical common building types that you would see in the city of Glendora. So a variety of different kind of single family homes with alleys where the garage is accessed by an alley, but then there's also single family homes where the garage comes out to the street. You have different kinds of accessory units configurations. So the guest house is kind of the most common one, the one on the right, where simply putting the accessory unit is a guest house located in the back of the lot. Couple different kinds of lower scale, smaller multifamily developments. One that we call the bungalow court, which is, there's some examples of that very close here to City Hall. You imagine it's basically 4 units that gather around a kind of common courtyard or kind of green, sometimes 6 or 8 units, but they're generally pretty small. There's the 3-story townhome development, which in some cases is a very large project, a very large site, which is what you have most of the time here in Glendora. But in Azusa, you see some of these on like infill lots where it's maybe like 4 units facing onto Route 66. So these sometimes show up as kind of small infill developments. And then we have their kind of large scale mixed use development. That's a possibility. So 2 different kinds. One we call a podium. That means it's the type of development where there's a concrete deck, parking garage. That's the podium, and then there's a wood framed residential structure above it. That's one kind of development. That's the recent development you mentioned in Azusa is of that nature. And then the wrap structure, which is more or less the Avalon structure on Route 66 today. And that's where there is a large parking structure in the middle of a building that is basically a wood frame that kind of wraps around that parking structure. And these are the 2 most kind of common multifamily mixed-use development types in the region. There's a couple different like commercial developments. So you got your Main Street, kind of standard Main Street development, and then a kind of strip scale, like, and put it onto like the Route 66 or kind of strip retail. There's big box included. So what we've done is we've tried to describe all these pretty common building typologies and kind of development types that categorize most of the kind of applications that the staff sees here in Glendora. And what we'll end up doing in the next iteration of this document is that each one of these diagrams is going to have a whole series of annotations that point to it that will say like parking lot design, go see section, 21 point B point whatever of the zoning code to get the details on what we expect for parking lot design and a Main Street retail. Or storefront design, for example, will have standards for how transparent storefronts should be. So you're going to go see this section. So these will be annotated so that it'll help people get the high level problems, understand them really quickly, like how to navigate what's, as I said, could be a pretty big ordinance. So this would be the illustrated guide, if you will, to that, and hopefully be something user friendly. So as Hans and I both mentioned, ultimately the objective design standards are going to be incorporated into the city's zoning code as a kind of full-scale replacement of what is currently Appendix 21B, which is really your existing design guidelines. So you've got a good place in the zoning code to take it. So we imagine taking all of that, replacing it in total with new standards. But in addition to that, there are a number of other standards elsewhere in the code that we need to address. So general regulations 21.03 is the portion of the code that covers things like landscaping and lighting and fences and walls and rooftop equipment. Those are all things that we typically try and cover in objective design standards. As we look at those sections of the general regulations, we find that they're maybe inadequate to cover many of the circumstances of what we see in other communities. So there's some amendments that are going on in a number of these different sections elsewhere in the code. So one of the big challenges that we're facing is as we write all this, we've got to keep cross-referencing different parts of the code and kind of editing. And as Hans also mentioned, we're editing two of the specific plans. If you look at either one of those specific plans for regulations on fences and walls, they're different than what's in the zoning code. So if we're going to consolidate everything into one set of standards through the zoning code, we have to think through what's the best standards coming from the two specific plans, clean up that language, integrate it into a new ordinance. It's been a pretty big effort. We basically have a really good kind of full-scale working draft in front of the city staff at this point of all of this. And so we've been working through that first set of edits or kind of draft with the staff, and they've been looking at our work and providing comments, and we'll do another round of edits over the holidays, I imagine, or in the coming months to sort of get this to a place where it'll be ready for some degree of public consumption. But that's the huge scale of it. The other thing I want to say is that there is in your staff report, there is an outline of how we think the new Appendix 21B will look. So you can see the kind of high level sections or chapters of that. But they have to kind of dive into some of those details if you like. But with that, happy to take any questions and comments.
Thank you, Alan. Commissioner Koss?
I agree with you. Getting that many responses back on a survey is huge. The fact that you got 500, so that's pretty impressive. I'm also not surprised that they chose that particular commercial storefront because, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's exactly what downtown looks like.
Yes.
Glendora Avenue. Yeah. So it's very much what we're used to here.
Yeah.
I think this is very impressive. I appreciate the scope of what this involves and the amount of work that has gone into this, the amount of time that's gone into this. And it's not a small task, and I appreciate that. So my understanding is once we finalize these, this is going to be kind of like a handbook to say, if you're building in Glendora, these are the styles you can build. And these are what buildings in Glendora need to look like. Is that correct?
That is the current direction we're working towards. And I would slightly caveat that in this sense that we'll probably have this kind of inventory of architectural styles that development over a certain scale will have to work within if they want to utilize the objective design standards pathway. It will be a handbook in the sense that all the city's expectations will be pretty clearly laid out in a series of very clear, true, false, yes, no, shall do this kinds of statements with measurable metrics that says, you should make your E, or you shall make your E 12 inches deep.
Okay.
You should have deep eaves. things of that nature is what we're working through. The reason I'm not saying it's 100% a handbook is that in many cases, what we're doing is that we're saying you must have facade articulation, and you should choose one of the following 3 measurable ways of doing that, delivering on that goal.
Okay.
So there will still be a certain amount, there will still be a high degree of kind of design choice exercised by applicants and their architects
Okay.
as to how they meet that goal and what's the best form of articulation to respond to a particular site.
Right, because we don't want all our buildings to look exactly the same.
Exactly, that's
Right,
exactly
we-
the challenge.
Right, we don't want to have a bunch of, cookie cutter buildings either. Now, have we decided that then that all of our buildings are going to be strictly residential and strictly commercial, or are we going to have any formulation for mixed use?
The design standards we're working on will address mixed-use development, so that remains under what we're
That'll be
doing.
part of it too.
It's
Okay,
still, that is a possibility, and whether that happens whether a particular site becomes mixed use will depend on whether the underlying zoning, which we're not changing, zone for that lot allows for it, and whether an owner, developer chooses to do a mixed use
Okay.
project.
okay. I just wondered if we were still planning on going in that direction.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, we're definitely addressing mixed use development at kind of different scales and
Okay, great. Thank you. And again, the hard work that you've done and as well as city staff, the scope of this is just enormous and I appreciate that.
Thank you. If I may, to pick up on something you said about the architectural styles to respond to the public speaker who addressed you before the meeting started. I would generally, as somebody who's trained as an architect, agree it's hard to codify good design. That being said, the charge that cities have been given the states is you have to. You have to do it. And we may not agree that it's the best thing to do artistically, but we have to give it our best effort to try and define what the minimum design aesthetic in the community should be through this process. And it's one of the reasons it's very challenging is because we have to take
I just,
an architecture and try and figure out how to describe it in numerical terms, such that,
we just don't want to have all of our buildings looking exactly the same.
Yeah,
That's the challenge.
right. So that's why our approach has been like oftentimes in many of these, you'll see ultimately it's a menu. You must do this by picking 2 of the items standards off of a list of 5 or something like that. And if you're a bigger building, maybe you have to do 3 of the 5. That's how we're structuring most of the standards that we're writing.
Thank you. Commissioner Nord?
Yeah, my only question would be the leeway that staff has, or let's say they pick one of the 2, but simply just doesn't blend in with the neighborhood. It's a complete outlier. How much leeway, how much, I know there's some administrative decisions that can be made in the planning department and doesn't never have to come to the planning commission or city council for recommendation. But how much leeway is there for them
Yeah,
to say,
it's an excellent-
yeah, this just doesn't fit?
It's a very good question, and that's one of the reasons we're favorable towards this menu approach to say you must achieve this goal, and here's 3 to 5 ways of achieving that goal, because not only does it give the applicants some degree of choice about how they design their buildings, but it also gives the city staff an opportunity to say, yeah, you picked this scheme or this goal, but it's not the right solution for this site. We'd really encourage you to pick one of the other ones. So that's, or even like if we could really end up working through architectural styles, it will probably be, you must pick one of these 6 styles as the kind of preferred style, for a multifamily or a mixed use development. So again, staff could say, as they're reviewing pre-applications, they could say, yeah, I know you've done this kind of building and the Googie architecture 10 times in other communities, but in Glendora, it should be a Spanish revival for this particular site. And so it leaves some leeway for staff to kind of be in the design process.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Vice Chair Crimmins?
Thank you again for the information and presentation. Just to echo Commissioner Costa, I know this is a pretty colossal undertaking by you guys and city staff as well. So thank you again. And then just to reiterate that this is something that we're required to do. It's not something that we chose to do. And it is a difficult task to kind of put numbers on art or design. A couple questions. Why lump single-family dwellings in with this? It sounds like it's just making it, or it's adding to the workload and
Well, I'll let city staff answer why they asked us to also write standards for a single family. That being said, the scale of complexity in the standards grows as the scale of the building grows. So the approach we've taken on single family has been very light-handed. Our early draft of the standards we have for single family, I think anybody who's going to build a new single family home and wants it to look nice is going to do the things we've written in as the standards already. So it's not it hasn't dramatically complicated the work. It's the mixed use and the multifamily development from 3 units up to 300 is where the real complexity lies.
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can add if you want to, like the rationale in adding single family in, I mean, because, you know, the overwhelming majority of the city's developable land is built with single family. And the majority of the work that is done by the planners in terms of processing, just even administrative applications and building and sometimes engineering relates to remodeling and adding on to sometimes tearing down and rebuilding single-family homes. I mean, that happens a lot. So we wanted, we wanted also some way to, apply some level of, objective design review to additions and remodels to single-family homes as well. Because really right now we don't have, in most areas, because they were developed in the 50s and 60s when design review really wasn't even a consideration. I mean, in Glendora, it just, I think there was a predominant, if you look at homes developed during that period, mostly they're ranch style homes for the most part in Glendora and throughout the region. So, we wanted a way to also, process those remodels and rebuilds and applications by applying some sort of, administrative, review for the design of those types of developments.
I might add to that. The other thing that's, we've come before you previously with different zoning code updates. And so, in the last year or so, we've allowed now, there's 2-story ADUs, SB9 units, second-story additions to homes, which used to have to go through a process, or now they don't anymore, through a discretionary type process. So DPR. So there's been a lot of interest, I think, with those updates in, how we encourage good design and now require it, hopefully through this process, those sort of changes in the single family zoning districts. Because now you're through SB9, you can have 4 units by right on a lot, or lot split in 2 units on each side. So some of those changes, we felt it was important to have standards, an appropriate level of standards, given the sort of changing dynamic of single family zoning and development patterns.
Thank you.
Well, maybe just add one more thing is that as staff looking through plan checks and projects is often frustrating when there's little or no standards for single family at times, when you see projects that are very poorly drawn, because a lot of single families are done by draftsmen or whatever, and they're not even consistent with their own house or let alone the neighborhood. So this will allow us to sort of kind of dictate for some of those really bad ones to say like, hey, there are some standards you should work up to make it consistent with yourself or at least your neighborhood in some cases. So by allowing that allowance is merely an improvement to, even though the state's requiring us to do objective design standards, we're also using this as an opportunity to do some enhancements to our code when we can.
Thank you. And then one last one. This is probably a little ahead of where we need to be, but is there something built in here so that these standards can kind of live and breathe and evolve over time? I mean, what is popular today in 10 years? Is it revisited on some cadence, or is there any thought put into that yet?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, one of the cautionary things, and we're sort of doing this work because the state told us to do it a couple of years ago, is that everybody in the state's doing it for the first time, and we're not going to get it right. We're going to need to revisit the standards at some point in the future, amend them, change them, address unforeseen circumstances. Maybe sometimes the standards are too onerous that we thought were just fine when it first gets drafted. So how frequent these will be revisited, it'll be kind of a decision, a policy decision by the city. But insofar as this is going to live as part of the municipal code, ultimately, I would imagine some sort of routine updates of it or kind of amendments to the design standards would be potentially be part of any sort of routine maintenance of the code as the code goes through regular kind of, updates and kind of revisions. And previous cities I worked in, there was always a big code update about once every 18 months, and it just cleaned up a bunch of stuff. Make it, deal with changes in state law about how, hairdressers are regulated and whatever, and then you could clean up other stuff that we knew needed to be addressed.
Perfect. I just want to thank staff again and the consultants for all the hard work you guys have done on this and getting this to us. It's a really great document. I had a question about the images of the houses and buildings in there. Are they all from properties in Glendora?
Not all, no, but we tried to pick images that were properties in Glendora. If we could, they're really good, excellent examples we wanted to hold up. And if we couldn't find them, and that was the case for a lot of the larger mixed use, then we were just trying to go the next city over. So that's why there's a certain number of Azusa images in there, or San Dimas images, or Claremont, is because we're trying to stay within the San Gabriel Valley. So we're not pointing at images and then somebody points out, well, that's in Santa Monica. That makes no sense here in Glendora, right? So
Would it make sense in the report to have the location of the images? I mean, or do people do that? I know on this commission, we talked about architectural style, right? And then
we could look at kind of revisiting and having a caption that indicates like where that structure, where that photo is, or what city or kind of general location, or
might help, because I know we just had stuff, right? And to know here that, oh, that's close to that property we're looking at now, or whatever works. So that was one comment I had. The other comment would be, in these types of reports, would you list out the survey results of the styles that were more favored?
It's funny, I was just talking with our staff this afternoon about whether we should amend the user's guide to include information about the survey to sort of back up some of the kind of decisions that are included in there. We can talk to staff about whether that's appropriate, we sort of think, well, obviously it's gonna be part of the staff reports. Everybody understands what was the public process that led to what's being asked to be adopted, but we could easily write a page of what that looks like and put it in to the user's guide.
Yeah, I guess I only asked that because maybe it helps with the developer as they come in, lending them towards a certain style. They already know the community likes that style, right? That's why they would be coming.
Yeah, and in other communities where we've done this kind of work, that's the main reason the staff wants to see the survey results being documented as part of their working user's manual, is because it does help them when they're sitting across the table from an applicant. Well, the community prefers this, so you'll have a better reception if you listen.
Maybe that's something you update every 5 or 10 years with style changes, so then you can relate that to the customers that come in. So, yeah, well, I think it's great. Those were my comments. Any other commissioners want to circle back? Nope. All right. At this time, I'll request a motion to receive, update, and provide feedback on progress made drafting the objective design standards in accordance with the adopted housing element in state law.
Make a motion to approve,
I'll second.
receive, and file.
I'll second.
Thank you. So we have a motion made by Commissioner Norwood, seconded by Commissioner Cost. I will now conduct an oral roll call. Commissioner Cost,
Yes.
Commissioner Norwood,
Yes.
Vice Chair Crimmins,
Yes.
Chair Faber.
Yes.
Motion carries 4-0.
All right. At this time, we're going to invite commissioner and staff to give closing comments. Anybody, Commissioner Cost?
Actually, I would like to publicize that the Glendora Chamber of Commerce is having their first annual Family Health and Wellness Expo this Saturday, October 12th from 10 to 4. They're going to have a lot of local businesses that specialize in health and wellness areas. They're going to have free classes, workshops, giveaways, that type of thing. They'll be at the Public Library and Bidwell Forum. So if you are around on October 12th, 10 to 4, stop by. You'll get some great, giving away, they're gonna have free classes, lots of giveaways. So, stop by because you'll learn a lot of things about, health and wellness and learn about some great businesses in the community.
Thank you. Commissioner Norwood,
I have nothing to add tonight. Thank you.
Commissioner Crimmins,
Just again, thank you to staff and everybody for the presentations and the information. I know it's a lot of work.
any staff closing comments?
Yes, just a reminder, our next meeting will be November 5th, believe it or not. We're coming up to the second to last meeting of the year. And we already have 2 items that we're working on for that agenda. So we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you. And then I'll just close with thanking staff again for all the hard work you've done. And it's coming along great. It's going to be interesting to see survey results too, so we can keep our finger on the pulse of the community. So looks like we're going to adjourn the meeting at 8:30.